Hello, everyone. Tonight we're going to be discussing the Chinese Communist Revolution of 1949. We just finished discussing the Cold War, which brought us into Europe all the way up to 1991. What we're going to be doing now is we're going to be going backwards and we're going to be taking the different regions of the world and bringing them up to about 1991 as well. This process that we're talking about it involves nationalism and it also involves decolonization as we move forward. The first place we're going to be talking about is China, and China is going to experience something called the Communist Revolution of 1949. The Communist Revolution of 1949 is going to make China into the second communist nation in the world after the Russians become communist in 1917. So we have to kind of backtrack a little bit to get up to 1949. So we're going to go back to a little bit earlier in the year where we see how this kind of sets up. As we could tell from the map, this is where China is located. You can see that the bottom right, though, that is Vietnam, so let's just be careful of that. But you can see this red area, this is going to be China. So as we look forward, we have to look back. So we look back to this image, which we looked at much earlier in the year. And what this shows us is that during the late 1800s and then, during the late 1700s and then the majority of the 1800s, China really tried to dominate their own policies by creating an isolationist policy. They tried to reject all foreign influence. Even though Europeans tried to trade, the Chinese said that the Europeans had nothing to offer. They called the Europeans barbarians and said that they were the Celestial Empire and that the Europeans had nothing to offer. Well, we know how that kind of ended up. Because of China's isolationism, they remained behind technologically. Now, whenever you're behind technologically, you are not going to advance militarily as well. So as time went by, the British, who insisted on trading, began to trade opium to the Chinese. We know how that kind of ended up. The opium trade really destroyed the Chinese economy, really hurt their society as a whole, which resulted in the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842, which we know the British won very easily because they had more technology and the Chinese just couldn't compete. Then we see that as a result of that, you had the Treaty of Nanjing, which was considered an unequal treaty, which is going to give the British trading rights. It's going to give them extraterritoriality. It's going to give them residency privileges. It's going to give them the island of Hong Kong. All of these things are going to be things that are going to be aspects of how China is going to be suffering through this. China is then going to be carved into spheres of influence by foreign powers. And those spheres of influence are going to be economic territories controlled by foreign nations, which you can see the cartoon on the bottom. As we move forward, we know that China is going to lose the Sino-Japanese War. They're going to the Boxer Rebellion, which is a way to reject, foreign influence in China, is going to fail as well. And we know as a result of all of this, China during the 19th century is going through what's called a period of shame. They're really showing no success. The Manchu dynasty is in full decline. Foreigners are coming in and they're taking control of the economic resources that China can provide. So the 19th century in China is really kind of just completely, they're really falling apart. And that's going to lead what's called the Revolution of 1911, which is going to be led by Sun Yat-sen or Sun Yat-sen. Now, the Revolution of 1911 is the culmination of all of that bad stuff of the 1800s. The Revolution of 1911 is essentially going to do a few things. One, it's going to end dynastical rule in China, which means the Manchu or the Qing dynasty is going to come to an end at that point. And it's going to be replaced by a government that Sun Yat-sen was hoping to be democracy. He doesn't ever achieve that democracy, but there's a hope that he could have it. He tries to model his government ideas after places like the United States, and he really is hoping for a successful China moving forward. He also at this time is trying to get rid of all foreign influence, get Europeans out of China, and he adopts principles of socialism. And those ideas of socialism are really going to try to meet the needs of the peasants. He's going to try to promote equality throughout China. Now, these things all sound really, really good, but the only thing that really comes to success from this is the demise of the Manchu dynasty. The Manchu dynasty does come to an end with this, but unfortunately, Sun Yat-sen does not stay very long in China. He leaves China pretty quickly. He goes and studies democracy in other parts of the world, and China falls into a period of time of chaos where during the 1910 to 1920, China is going to be run by warlords, and you're going to see a lot of chaos within China. Now, at this time, Remember that during the 1920s and 1930s, what we see is we see communism coming out of Russia and really spreading around the globe. Because of the Great Depression of the 1920s and 1930s, communism really kind of picks up steam in terms of this idea of a solution to economic problems. Well, as the Nationalist Party, which Sun Yat-sen was the leader of, but he obviously had to pass it down to a leader named Chiang Kai-shek or Jiang Jieshi. Jiang Jieshi was the leader of the Nationalist Party. He followed Sun Yat-sen's leadership, but he promoted more of a dictatorship than democracy, even though he preached for democracy. Very anti-communist, supported by capitalists, supported by the wealthy Chinese, and he was an ally of the United States because obviously he believed in capitalism. So Chiang Kai-shek was the leader of this nationalist group, but he really wasn't meeting the needs of the people. And during the 1920s and 1930s, we saw that, especially the 1920s, that he really wasn't meeting the needs of the majority, which were these poor peasants that couldn't own land or that just were starving or really suffering. The opposite side of this coin is going to be Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is a very important figure in Chinese history. We're going to be spending a couple of days on him in the weeks to come. Mao Zedong was the leader of the Communist Party in China. He believed that the government should take ownership of the private property and redistribute the land, right? Just like Lenin talked about peace, land, and bread, Mao is also with this idea of we're going to redistribute the land to the peasants. He is a big supporter of the peasants, and we'll see in a second or two, the peasants are really going to support him as well. This period of time in China, from the mid-1920s, really, during the 1930s, is going to be known as the Chinese Civil War. And it's this battle between the Kuomintang, which is the Nationalist Party, which is led by Jiang Jieshi or Chiang Kai-shek, versus the communist leadership of Mao Zedong. Now, initially, within the Chinese Civil War, the nationalists really have the strength. They have the military backing. They have the strength of the government. They have wealth on their side. But as time goes on, the communists gain more and more support. One of the big things that what happens with communism and how communism gains support is an event called the Long March. This is an important event which is going to help the Chinese gain support during the Civil War. Now, the Long March I always like to refer to as the Long Run, because essentially what's happening is the Jiang Jieshi tries to corner the Communist Party and try to really, kill them off, get rid of them, end the Civil War. And Mao takes his people and he begins this basically retreat throughout China. And you can see the map there showing you how this retreat kind of worked. And it's really a run because they're really running away from them. But what's interesting about this point in Chinese history is what essentially is happening during the Long March is Mao is gaining support from the peasantry. As they're retreating, as they're running by, they're speaking to people. They're telling people about the good things about communism, why communism is such a good idea, and they're really appealing to the communists. So by the time this is all over with, even though the Chinese Communist Army is down to nothing, they're gaining support from the peasantry as it goes forward. And then the Chinese Civil War goes on hold. During the 1930s, if you remember, Japan is going to invade China. And they're going to interrupt the entire Chinese Civil War by taking over their land. You could see the blue area up here. That's going to kind of show you exactly how that's going to go. And then you could see the red, which is going to be dominated by the communists, and the greens that's going to be controlled by the nationalists. But you could see that they're really going to interrupt things. This is the time of the rape of Nanking, and it really breaks up this Civil War. But while this is going on, the communists are still gaining more and more support. And by the time we get out of this, and we're in the middle of the 1940s, and World War II is coming to an end, the Chinese Communist Party is gaining more and more power. Because what Mao does is he appeals to the peasants. Please remember that. That's super important. Because he promises land distribution. He promises them food. He promises them that they'll have equality. So he gains more and more support by the peasants. And that leads us to this thing called the Chinese Communist Revolution. I'm not going to read to you this slide, but in 1949, we know that Mao is going to take over China. He's going to take it on, under the communist flag. Chiang Kai-shek or Jiang Jieshi is going to be forced to flee China. He goes to Taiwan, where he sets up a democratic capitalist society that is going to be supported by the United States because of the Cold War. Mao is going to stay in China, and he's going to rule China until the mid 1970s. So from like 1949 until the mid 1970s, 1976, I believe, Mao is going to have control over China. And the things that are going to go under China during that quarter century are going to be amazing. He's really going to develop a communist state in China. But in doing so, of course, you can imagine the amount of death and problems that China is going to experience during that time. So that's it for tonight. Remember the Communist Revolution. China becomes a communist state. Mao Zedong is the leader of this. It's the culmination of that Chinese Civil War. And what we're going to be looking forward to is the leadership of Mao in days to come.